In the long, brutal calculus of the Second World War, victory was often measured in inches, in yards, or in the agonizingly slow capture of a single ruined city. But the war was also a shadow contest of intellects, a desperate, high-stakes race waged in secret laboratories and on classified testing ranges. This was a war of physics, of engineering, and of industrial scale, where a single, revolutionary invention could change the entire strategic landscape overnight. The world remembers the most famous of these, the atomic bomb, a weapon of apocalyptic finality. It remembers the Enigma machine, an intellectual key that unlocked the enemy's darkest secrets. But there was a third secret, a wonder weapon. That was not a futuristic jet or a terror rocket, but a device so small it could be held in the palm of the hand. It was developed under a veil of secrecy, so total that its $2 billion budget, a figure equivalent to the Manhattan Project, was hidden in plain sight, dispersed across hundreds of shell corporations and nondescript university contracts. It required the mobilization of over 800 companies, from radio manufacturers to farm equipment factories, all working on components without any one of them knowing what the final product was. When it was finally unleashed, it was so devastatingly effective that it left enemy commanders in a state of baffled, terrified shock. German soldiers, huddled in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, would call it magic, or the fire that searches for you, as artillery shells suddenly began exploding in the air above their foxholes, raining down a perfect, inescapable storm of shrapnel. Japanese pilots, diving on American carriers in the Pacific, would call it an impossible wall of death, a black curtain of flak that would reach up and swat their planes from the sky before they could even get close. Admiral Lewis Strauss of the US Navy would later write that this one device was the decisive factor in turning the tide of the Pacific War. The man in charge of its development, the brilliant scientist, Vannevar Bush, would state that this invention was second only to the atomic bomb in its influence on the war. This is the story of that device, the VT Proximity Fuze. It was, in essence, a tiny, rugged, self-contained radar system, transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator. No larger than a beer bottle, built to be fired from a cannon. It was a thinking bullet, a shell that didn't need to hit its target to kill it. It only needed to get close. This is the story of the 5 impossible engineering miracles required to build it, and the moment of realization. It created, on battlefields across the globe, as the enemies of the Allies discovered, with lethal suddenness, that the fundamental rules of warfare had changed. To understand why this invention was so critical, one must first understand the single greatest mathematical problem of the war, hitting a moving target. In 1940, as German bombers rained explosives on London during the Blitz, the British Anti-Aircraft Command was faced with a horrifying statistic. By their own calculations, it took, on average, over 20,000 5-inch artillery shells to guarantee a single on one high-altitude bomber. The problem was not the gun, it was the fuse. A conventional anti-aircraft shell does not explode on impact. It is designed to explode in the air, spraying a cloud of shrapnel. To do this, it relies on a time fuse. This was, in essence, a complex mechanical clock, a wind-up timer built into the shell's nose with the precision of a Swiss watch. Before firing, a gun crew would spot the enemy bomber. They would use a complex analog computer, a director, to calculate the plane's speed, its altitude, and its direction. This director would then predict, with furious, gear-grinding calculation, where that plane would be in, say, 15 seconds. The gunner would then take a shell, set its tiny clockwork fuse to 15 seconds, and fire it. The entire engagement was a prayer to mathematics. If the plane changed its altitude by even 50 feet, if it chinked left or right, if the director's calculation was off by 1/10 of a second, That $2,000 shell would explode harmlessly in an empty patch of sky hundreds of yards away from its target. The air over London was filled with these useless black puffs of smoke. It was a spectacularly inefficient and terrifyingly expensive way to fight a war. The problem was even worse at sea. A warship, under attack by a fast-moving, jinking dive bomber, had even less time to react. The ship was rolling and pitching. The target was moving at 300 miles per hour. The entire engagement was over in seconds. The odds of a gunner successfully calculating the correct time fuse setting were almost zero. By 1942, this vulnerability had become an existential crisis for the US Navy. The new, terrifying Japanese Val dive bombers were proving lethally effective. And later, the kamikaze, a target that wanted to hit the ship, made the problem an emergency. The Navy's entire doctrine, built around the aircraft carrier and the battleship, was at risk of being rendered obsolete. If they could not stop an airplane, they could not win the war. Risk of per magic bullet. They didn't need a more accurate gun. They needed a smarter shell. The idea had been floated for decades. What if the shell could decide for itself when to explode? What if it carried its own sensor? But the concept was pure science fiction. The proposed solutions, acoustic sensors that listened for an engine drowned out by the shell's own shriek, or optical sensors that saw the target's shadow, useless at night or in cloud, were wildly impractical. Then, in September of 1940, the entire technological landscape of the war changed. A secret British delegation, the Tizard mission, arrived in Washington, D.C. They came to a neutral America bearing a black-painted metal box, a suitcase, full of their most desperate revolutionary secrets. They were offering their entire portfolio of scientific breakthroughs in exchange for America's industrial might. In that box was the cavity magnetron, the tiny, powerful radar generator that would revolutionize the air war. But there was also a much quieter, less developed proposal. It was a concept for a proximity fuse, a shell that would use radio waves to detect its target. The British concept was promising, but their top scientists were already consumed by the radar war. The idea was handed over to America's newly formed National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC, a civilian organization headed by the brilliant engineer and administrator Vannevar Bush. Bush assigned the impossible task to a hard-driving, pragmatic physicist named Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Tuve's group was given the nondescript cover name Section T. Their mission: build a fully functional radar set, complete with a transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, and a detonator, and build it small enough to fit inside a 5-inch artillery shell. The single directive was, in reality, 5 separate engineering challenges, any one of which was enough to break the entire project. First, the miniaturization. In 1940, a radio transmitter was a piece of furniture. It was a box the size of a suitcase, filled with glowing glass vacuum tubes, complex wiring, and heavy transformers. Tuve's team had to shrink all of this, a transmitter and a receiver, down to the size of a beer bottle. Second, the acceleration. This tiny, delicate radio set had to survive being fired out of a cannon. When a 5-inch naval shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,000 miles per hour in less than 20 feet. The G-force inside that shell casing is not 100 Gs or 1,000 Gs. It is 20,000 times the force of gravity. A 1-pound object inside that shell would instantaneously weigh 10 tons. Under this colossal, mind-bending force, solid steel bends like clay. Third, the spin. It wasn't just acceleration. To stabilize in flight, an artillery shell spins. It leaves the barrel rotating at 25,000 rotations per minute, RPM. This adds a centrifugal force of thousands of Gs, pulling everything outwards. Any component, any wire, any drop of solder, not perfectly centered and balanced, would be torn from its moorings with incomprehensible violence. Fourth, the power source. The fuse needed electricity. But you can't put a 1940s era battery in a shell. It would be shattered by the G-force, and its corrosive liquid acid would be a nightmare. They needed to invent a battery that was completely inert, just a pile of metal and dry chemicals, that could be activated by the shock of firing, and then, in a fraction of a second, start generating the high voltage needed to power a radio set. Fifth, reliability and mass production. This couldn't be a hand-built prototype. It had to be mass-produced by the millions, by a workforce that didn't even know what it was making, and had to be ruggedized, to the point of absurdity, to work perfectly, every single time, in the heat of the Pacific, in the frozen cold of the Arctic. Of all these, the most daunting was the vacuum tube. The heart of all 1940s electronics, the component that made radio possible, was a delicate, glowing bulb of glass containing a web of hair, thin wires, and fragile filaments, and Section T had to figure out how to fire it from a cannon. In late 1940, Merle Tuve gathered his new team of physicists. He held up a standard glass vacuum tube and then, without a word, dropped it on the floor. It shattered. This, he told the stunned scientists, is your first problem. The challenge was not just to build a tiny radar. It was to build a tiny radar out of glass that could survive a force equivalent to being hit by a freight train, all while spinning at 400 revolutions per second. The race for the thinking bullet was on. The entire Proximity Fuze project rested on solving the riddle of the vacuum tube. In 1940, the team at Section T, led by physicist James Van Allen, who would later become a legend in the space race, began their seemingly hopeless task. Their first experiments were almost comically primitive. They took standard, off-the-shelf vacuum tubes, the kind you could find in any family radio, and started dropping them. They dropped them from a few feet onto a wooden plank, then onto steel. They shattered. They encased them in wax and dropped them. They shattered. They fired them from a simple air-powered cannon into a pile of cotton waste. They pulverized. The breakthrough came not from trying to protect the tube, but from redesigning it from the ground up. The team realized the problem wasn't just the glass, it was the internals. A standard tube had a delicate, suspended latticework of a filament, a grid, and a plate, all held in place by a few thin wires. Under 20,000 Gs, this internal structure would tear itself apart, and the resulting shrapnel would destroy the glass envelope. The solution was to make the tube so small, and its internal components so rugged and so close together, that there was simply no room for them to move or break. The team, collaborating with the Sylvania and RCA companies, began to innovate. They threw out the standard tube design. Instead of a delicate filament, they developed a tiny metal pin coated in an oxide strong as a nail. Instead of a fragile wire grid, they created a tiny, rigid metal spring that was wound so tightly it was almost solid. The entire assembly was shrunk down to the size of a thumbnail, and the components were locked in place with thick glass supports. To test these new ruggedized tubes, the team built a series of increasingly violent contraptions. First was a centrifuge, a high-speed spinning wheel that subjected the tubes to the 25,000 RPM centrifugal force. Tubes that survived were then taken to a test cannon. But firing a real artillery piece for every test was expensive and slow. So, they built a vertical drop test rig at the National Bureau of Standards. This was a 55-foot steel tube, at the bottom of which was a thick, hardened steel plate. The prototype fuses were placed in a test shell, dropped down the tube, and smashed into the plate at a velocity calculated to perfectly mimic the 20,000 G deceleration of hitting a target. In the early days, the teams would sift through the resulting pile of glass dust and metal fragments, looking for any component that had survived, and then redesign the parts that had failed. After months of this brutal trial and error, they had it, a tiny, ugly, immensely strong vacuum tube that could be fired from a cannon. But this only solved one part of the problem. They still had to power it. the fuse needed a battery. But like the tubes, any standard battery was a non-starter. A dry cell battery wasn't dry. It contained a wet, corrosive paste that would be torn apart by spin and acceleration. A wet cell. Car battery was even worse. A sloshing container of liquid acid. The project needed a battery that was, for all intents and purposes, a dead, inert object until the exact moment the gun was fired. The solution, developed by a team at the National Carbon Company, the makers of ever-ready batteries, was a masterpiece of electrochemical engineering. It was called the reserve battery. It was not so much a battery as a potential battery. It consisted of a stack of small, ring-shaped carbon discs and zinc plates, all separated by thin, dry, paper-like spacers. In its normal state, it was completely inert. You could smash it with a hammer and nothing would happen. The secret was a small glass vial, or ampoule, nestled in the center of the stack. This ampoule was filled with a liquid electrolyte, chromic acid. When the gun was fired, the 20,000 Gs of acceleration would instantly shatter this glass vial. The 25,000 RPM spin would then act as a perfect centrifuge, forcing the liquid electrolyte outwards, where it would instantly saturate the paper spacers. The moment the liquid hit the zinc and carbon plates, the electrochemical reaction began, and the battery would come to life, generating its full 150-volt output in less than half a second, all while the shell was still screaming its way up the barrel of the gun. It was a battery that literally woke up from the shock of being fired. Now that the team had rugged tubes and a battery that could power them, they had to design the brain of the fuse. This was the most elegant part of the entire design. The fuse didn't need to be a complex, radar-guided system like a modern missile. It just needed to be a simple, clever detector. The circuit they designed was a brilliant, self-contained radio transceiver. The transmitter, a tiny oscillator circuit, would constantly emit a continuous radio wave, turning the metal shell casing itself into a transmitting antenna. This radio wave would wash out in a cone shape, about 70 feet wide, in front of the shell. As long as the shell was flying through empty air, this wave would simply radiate out into space. However, if the shell flew near a target, like the metal skin of an airplane, a portion of that radio wave would bounce back. This echo would be picked up by the fuse's receiver circuit. This reflected wave would interfere with the original outgoing wave, creating a tiny fluctuating signal known as a beat frequency, or the Doppler effect. This signal was the heartbeat of the target. The fuse, tiny amplifier, using its rugged tubes, would listen for this specific heartbeat. As the shell got closer to the plane, the signal from the reflected echo would get stronger very, very quickly. When this echo signal reached a specific preset electrical threshold, it would trigger an electronic switch. That switch would send a jolt of electricity from the battery to the detonator. But this led to one final safety problem. What stopped the fuse from simply detonating from the radio reflections off the ground or off the ship that fired it? The fuse needed a safety switch. The team built two. The first was a simple setback switch. This was a small, spring-loaded metal pin that was held in place. The shock of firing would slam this pin backward, completing a circuit and arming the fuse. But this wasn't safe enough. The real safety was a beautifully simple device. It was a small, spring-like strip of metal bent into an S shape that was blocking the electrical path to the detonator. This strip was held in place by a small, soft metal cup filled with mercury. Under the 25,000 RPM spin of the shell, the heavy liquid mercury was forced outwards, but the S-shaped spring was strong enough to resist it. As the shell flew, however, the spin would also cause the mercury to slowly leak out through a tiny, precisely drilled hole. After a set amount of time, about 1 to 2 seconds, long after the shell had left the gun, the mercury cup would be empty. With the mercury gone, The S-shaped spring was now free to unbend, moving out of the way and completing the firing circuit. Only now was the fuse live. It was now actively listening, its eyes open, waiting for that one final echo from a target. By late 1941, Section T had done it. They had a working prototype. They had a tiny radio, built of ruggedized tubes. They had a reserve battery that woke up on demand. And they had a simple, safe, and lethal brain that could detect a target and detonate at the perfect moment. All that was left was to see if it actually worked. The first full-scale test of the VT Fuze was scheduled for the morning of August 29, 1942, at the Navy's Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia. The mood was one of extreme tension. The test was simple. A series of radio-controlled Kingfisher target drones would be flown over a battery of 5-inch naval guns. First, the guns would fire shells equipped with standard, high-precision time fuses to establish a baseline. The gunners were the best in the Navy. They fired. The black puffs of smoke from the time-fused shells dotted the sky, all of them hundreds of yards away from the jinking drone. It was a perfect textbook demonstration of the problem. Then, Admiral Blandy gave the order to load the new VT fuses, codenamed POT. The gunners loaded 3 shells. They fired the first. It flew wide. They fired the second. It also missed. Merle Tuve felt his stomach sink. Perhaps the complex electronics were still failing. Then, the third gun fired. A single shell flew up, passed well behind the drone, and then, in a bright flash, exploded. There was a moment of stunned silence on the observation tower. Admiral Blandy, a man not given to emotion, turned to the scientists. He didn't shout, he just said, in an awestruck near whisper, "Jesus Christ." He knew, as did every man there, that he had just witnessed a miracle. The odds of a time fuzz shell making that kill were 20,000 to 1. This was not luck. This was a revolution. The success at Dahlgren lit a fire under the project. The problem was no longer, can we build one, but can we build millions? This was a challenge of industrial scale that would rival the Manhattan Project in its complexity. The program, now costing billions, was organized with ruthless, compartmentalized secrecy. Over 800 different companies were brought into the fold, but not a single one knew what they were making. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, known for its cheap radios and refrigerators, was retooled to become the master assembler, its factories placed under armed guard. Sylvania and RCA were tasked with mass-producing the ruggedized vacuum tubes, which were often disguised on shipping manifests as components for hearing aids. The National Carbon Company produced millions of the reserve batteries, which were explained away as power sources for weather balloons. A farm equipment factory in the Midwest might be stamping tiny metal springs, while a clock company in New England was machining the safety gears. It was a perfect, disarticulated supply chain. Hundreds of thousands of American workers, mostly women, built the most important weapon of the war without ever knowing it. And the quality control was brutal. At random, entire crates of fuses would be pulled from the assembly line, shipped to test ranges, and fired. If even 2 or 3% failed, the entire production batch, tens of thousands of units, was summarily rejected and destroyed. This ruthless ammunition-style testing was unheard of in electronics, but it was the only way to ensure the magic would work every single time. By late 1942, the fuses were rolling off the assembly line, but they were chained to a single, ironclad order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for naval use only. The fuse was absolutely, under any circumstances, forbidden from being fired over land. The great paralyzing fear was that a dud would be recovered by the Germans. If German scientists got their hands on a single unit, they would copy it. After all, German physics was among the best in the world. And the Allies, particularly the British, knew that a German proximity fuse, used against the massive, tightly packed American and British bomber streams over Europe, would be an unimaginable slaughter. It would hand air superiority back to the Luftwaffe and could change the entire course of the war. So the secret was kept. The fuses were only to be used over water, where any dud would sink, unrecoverable, to the bottom of the sea. The first shipment of 5,000 rounds was secretly loaded onto the cruiser USS Helena, bound for the desperate, shark-infested waters of the Solomon Islands. On January 5, 1943, the Helena was part of a task force near Guadalcanal when a Japanese thou type bomber appeared, screaming down out of the sun. The Helena's 5-inch gun director tracked the target. The new fuses were loaded. The guns fired. From the Japanese pilot's perspective, it must have been a moment of sheer, supernatural terror. He was executing his dive, jinking as he had been trained, watching the black puffs of flak from the other ships explode harmlessly hundreds of yards away. Then, a shell from the Helena flew past him, visibly missing. And in that instant, it exploded. An impossible wall of shrapnel materialized in empty air, ripping his wing from the fuselage. The Helena's gunners had just shot down an airplane with their second ever salvo of VT Fuze shells. This was the moment of realization that rippled through the Japanese Naval Air Service. Their veteran pilots, men who had scoffed at American anti-aircraft fire, began to report that the American flake had changed. It was no longer a game of dodging predictable puffs. It was a lethal, intelligent barrier. The Americans, they reported, seemed to be able to guide their shells. The statistical proof was overwhelming. Before the VT Fuze, it took the Navy, on average, 2,000 5-inch shells to kill one plane. By the spring of 1943, that number had plummeted. The Fuze was working better than the most optimistic projections. Its greatest test came in June of 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a battle that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy, in a desperate gamble, launched over 400 of its best carrier-based aircraft to destroy the American fleet. They were met not just by Hellcat fighters, but by a curtain of steel from the screening destroyers and cruisers. Japanese pilots, who had survived the American fighters, would dive on the carriers, only to be systematically and invisibly torn to pieces by the VT Fuze flak. Experienced aces were vaporized by shells that exploded with no warning. The battle broke the back of Japanese naval aviation forever, and it was the proximity fuse that had made the fleet's defensive screen impenetrable. This new magic weapon was even more critical against the kamikaze. A time fuse might get a hit that wounded the plane or killed the pilot, but the plane, now a deadweight missile, would still crash into the deck. The VT Fuze was a true hard-kill weapon. It was designed to explode at the optimal point, alongside or just above the cockpit, to ensure a catastrophic kill, disintegrating the plane and its pilot in midair, stopping the attack cold. It had, in no uncertain terms, saved the US Navy, but it was still a secret, confined to the Pacific. That is, until December of 1944, when a different enemy, in a different ocean of frozen, snow-covered trees, launched a desperate gamble of his own. In the summer of 1944, a new and terrifying threat emerged from across the English Channel. This was the V1, or Vogeltungswaffe, Heinz the Vengeance Weapon 1. It was a marvel of primitive, effective engineering. A 25-foot-long automated cruise missile, powered by a sputtering pulse jet engine that gave it the nickname the Buzz Bomb, or Doodlebug. Launched from ramps in occupied France, these weapons flew at 400 miles per hour, carrying a 1-ton warhead, and began to rain down on London in a new, indiscriminate blitz. The British defenses were, once again, proven useless. The problem of the V1 was the same as a dive bomber, only worse. It was too fast for most fighters of the day, and it was too low and too fast for conventional, time-fused anti-aircraft guns. The 20,000 shell per kill average was back, and the V1 was a cheap, mass-produced weapon. Hitler was launching hundreds per day. London was in a panic, and Churchill was desperate. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were now faced with a terrible dilemma. The VT Fuze was the perfect, tailor-made counter to the buzz bomb. But to use it, they would have to deploy it over land over the fields of southern England. The terror of a dud falling into German hands was still the paramount concern. For weeks, the chiefs debated, until the crisis in London became politically and strategically untenable. Finally, a compromise was reached. General Eisenhower gave the order for Operation Diver. The fuses were secretly shipped to Britain, but their use was restricted to the anti-aircraft batteries moved to the English coast. The V1s were only to be engaged after they had crossed the coastline, but before they reached the London suburbs. It was a risky gamble, but one they had to take. The moment of realization for the German planners in France must have been staggering. Suddenly, in late July 1944, their wonder weapon simply stopped working. The kill rate of the British anti-aircraft guns, which had been a pathetic 10 to 15%, shot up almost overnight. On the first day of the fuse's use, the gunners shot down 24% of the incoming targets. A week later, it was 55%. By the last week of August, the coastal gun batteries, now masters of their new magic, shell, were destroying 79% of all V1s that entered their kill zones. The fuse, in a matter of weeks, had rendered Hitler's first vengeance weapon militarily obsolete. It was a stunning, secret victory, but the fuse's greatest test was yet to come. That December, in 1944, Hitler played his last, desperate card. In the frozen, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, he launched a massive, surprise counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies smashed into a thin, weakly held American line, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. The weather was catastrophic, with thick fog and low-lying clouds that grounded the Allies' single greatest advantage, their air force. On the ground, in the fog and forests, it was an infantryman's fight, and the German Panzer Grenadiers were veterans, masters of infiltration and winter warfare. They were fighting against American GIs, who were, in many cases, exhausted and demoralized. A critical problem emerged for the American artillery. The Germans, masters of defense, knew how to survive a barrage. They knew that a standard high-explosive shell, which detonates on impact, is surprisingly ineffective against dug-in troops. The force of the explosion goes primarily up and out. A soldier huddled in a foxhole or dug in at the base of a thick pine tree would be terrifyingly shaken, but physically unharmed. The German strategy was simple: wait for the artillery to stop, then rise up and annihilate the American infantry assault. The situation was desperate, particularly around the besieged crossroads town of Bastogne. The Germans were massing for their final, all-out assaults. The Allied command, now facing a true strategic crisis and with their air support completely blind, made the single most important artillery decision of the war. On December 18, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the order to lift the land warfare ban. The VT fuses were to be released immediately to the artillery batteries of General Patton's Third Army, which was racing to relieve Bastogne. The secret was finally out. Crates of the new shells, still codenamed POT, were rushed to the frozen gun pits of the 105mm and 55mm howitzer batteries. The gun crews themselves didn't know what they had. The new fuses looked almost identical to the old ones. They were just given the order to set the fuses to proximity and fire. For the German soldiers, the moment of realization was not a scientific curiosity. It was an apocalyptic, supernatural terror. A veteran Panzer Grenadier squad would be huddled in their foxholes in the snow-covered forest, waiting for the inevitable American barrage to end. They heard the familiar, comforting shriek of incoming shells. But then, the unthinkable happened. The shells didn't hit the ground. They didn't bury themselves in the snow. Instead, with a terrifying, instantaneous crack, the entire barrage exploded at once, in the air, about 50 feet above their heads. This was the airburst, the single, most lethal type of artillery fire. The cone of shrapnel and high explosive was directed downwards, like an inverted shotgun. It rained 10,000 white-hot metal fragments directly into the German foxholes. There was no escape. It didn't matter if you were dug in behind a log or in a trench. The fuse magic had rendered all conventional infantry defenses completely obsolete. The trees themselves became a secondary weapon as the airburst shattered the frozen lumber, adding thousands of wooden splinters to the shrapnel storm. German morale, which had been high at the start of the offensive, simply broke. Captured prisoners were in a state of shock. They babbled to their interrogators about magic, screaming memes that search for you, and, impossible, artillery that could burst at the perfect height every single time. They were veterans. They knew what artillery was. This, they said, was not artillery. This was something else. The German offensive relied on massing infantry for their assaults, and now they could not mass. The moment a company of soldiers swarmed up for an attack, a single American artillery battalion, firing the VT Fuze, could and would annihilate them in seconds. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a German commander, would later state in an interrogation that the proximity fuse was the single most decisive factor in breaking the back of the German offensive. Patton, in his own journals, was even more blunt. He called the new fuse the weapon that won the war. When the smoke cleared and the war finally ended, the full story of the proximity fuse could be told. The final statistics were staggering. In the Navy, it had reduced the number of shells per kill from over 2,000 to less than 50. It had saved the fleets from the dive bomber and the kamikaze. In Britain, it had defeated the V-1 buzz bomb, turning a terror weapon into a harmless nuisance. And in the forests of the Ardennes, it had broken the back of Hitler's last army, vaporizing the German infantry and shattering their morale. It was not a giant tank, sleek jet, or a city-destroying bomb. It was a $2 billion, 2-pound package of impossible engineering, a tiny, rugged radio that could be fired from a cannon. It was the thinking bullet that the Allies had prayed for in 1940. It was a weapon of pure physics, a testament to the idea that a war of industrial might could be won by a handful of scientists in a quiet laboratory who had solved a problem that the enemy thought was unsolvable. The VT Fuze was, and remains, one of the most decisive and most secret technological triumphs in the history of modern warfare.